Gord Price, who's in the room, has often said publicly that when it comes to discussions and deliberations about the Gateway program, there's never anyone who's willing to publicly come out and defend it and speak to it. And I think it's a step better late than never to have this kind of a dialogue where we can discuss it with both sides of the story. I come not to praise Gateway, but to bury it. My view is that we basically have a short amount of time and a limited amount of resources to get our transportation future in line with where energy and climate change are going. And that was the sort of core focus of the book that I co-authored with Richard Gilbert, which is called Transport Revolutions. And in particular, we see energy and peak oil as the driver. It's two sides of the coin, with climate change being inextricably connected to energy use. But we think that energy futures could affect the value of a lot of infrastructure that exists and is being planned, and maybe with this economic crisis could be rushed ahead prematurely, or the value of which will be very questionable. If you believe that what I call the Beverly Hillbillies oil is here to stay, because that's the TV show that I grew up with in my generation, you know, if you think that we're going to have plenty of oil that will come to us under its own power, sort of shooting out of the ground and is just waiting to be discovered somewhere, there's no question that was the ideal fuel for the 20th century American dream, and largely North American dream, because I think Canada also bought into that, and that produced the auto-dependent highway-based transportation system that most regions of North America take for granted. This is one of the regions that actually didn't go and subscribe to that for the full story. We're now perhaps going to be one of the last jurisdictions in North America to put in that kind of a highway, major expansion of our bridge and highway system around auto and road-based transportation. Now, this is a graph that's familiar to many of you. It's from the Uppsala Hydrocarbon Petroleum Depletion Research Group. Richard and I read lots of literature on oil futures and depletion rates and these sorts of things. And one correlation that I will share with you is that there seems to be a direct relationship between a country's dependence on oil, particularly imported oil, and the sort of average curve peak that they see coming for oil depletion. That is to say, the U.S. Geological Survey, of course that may change in the next few days, but at least until January 20th, they were putting, you know, the peak out into the 2030s, I think closer to 2040. Sweden's a country, and then there are other countries that, you know, don't depend on oil, and their projections were a lot closer to now. Sweden is a country that's often a good sort of neutral body, and I think that this particular forecast of 2012, with an error band of plus or minus 5 years, you know, Bryn asked whether some people thought we were already past the peak, and you know, that could be. There were people in 2007 already saying, you know, we've hit the peak of oil production. It takes a little while after the peak to really have the evidence in place to see that. In any case, 2012 is a sort of a benchmark that we have adopted in our book as a good starting point, a good pivot point for transport planning. What this means is that everything that's built with the kind of long lifespan that infrastructure has will be obsolete if it's based around oil transportation primarily after 2012. The thing that's often missing from the debate and the discussion, at least the mass media discussion about energy futures, and the thing that I think is critical to try and understand the path, the change in path that we're either already or about to embark on, is that the second half of the world's oil is physically different from the first half. That's, you know, when people say, oh, well, we're reaching a halfway point, well, if you don't add any other information, many people would say, well, there's a lot more pressing things like climate change or the economic collapse or whatever to worry about. The point about the halfway point is that the second half is physically different. And here is an example of that in northern Alberta. The Athabasca oil sands and lots of other places in the world where the oil is not going to come to us in the Beverly Hillbillies fashion. The unconventional oil is much more like squeezing out a sponge, except you have to imagine the sponge is made out of rocks and sand. And it takes a lot of energy to do that, just like the sponge at your kitchen or bathroom counter at home. As you try and squeeze it out, you have to squeeze harder and harder to get the rest of the liquid out of it. And it's going to be roughly similar, I think, in a non-technical way, but this is something that needs to be conveyed to people to understand that the effort, both in terms of energy and in terms of money, is going to grow. Deep sea oil. There's plenty of deep sea oil out there. This one was discovered on your right just last year, the Tupi field in Brazil. It's 5 miles under the surface of the Atlantic, which is already a mile deep at that point. And the production cost last year was estimated at $90 a barrel. There's an example of a test well up in the Mackenzie Valley. So that's what polar oil drilling looks like. And if we want to preserve the environments locally and globally from this kind of oil production, the cost and the effort is going to be high. Well, how much money and energy will be available to expand global oil production? In other words, to keep the peak from happening, you have to increase production, because there's depletion that's going on. Countries like Mexico and Canada, for that matter, in conventional oil have peaked. So to get that balance back, you have to put money and energy in, and I think right now there is less available. It's more and more obvious, as projects are being shelved and canceled all over the world, especially in northern Canada. And I think there's going to be less than would be needed, I should say, to continue the sort of high carbon, high oil-based economy and society that we've gotten used to. Now, some of you may remember about a year and a half, 2 years ago, we had James Howard Kunstler visit as a fellow in urban sustainable development. For those of you who want to read the dark side of where things might go, I would recommend his Long Emergency book. The New York Times has referred to his view of the future as apocalyptic utopianism, with the idea being that it's going to take an apocalypse driven by energy and climate to sort of get us over the hump toward utopia. And the apocalypse, in his view, includes many dark social possibilities, including fascism, where people sort of require or expect or fall for the kind of leadership that's very authoritarian to preserve the unsustainable in the false hope of trying to do that. So if we expect that the second half of the world's energy is going to be physically different, using it is going to require different thinking than the first half did to avoid these kinds of dark fates ahead. That's where I part company with Kunstler. I think we do have the possibility, certainly, to think and act differently. And if we can do that and keep up with the change in our energy future as opposed to fall too far behind it, then the dark road isn't as likely as Jim might say that it was. But I think we have signs around us that there's lots of black swans appearing all of a sudden that suggest that there are some serious issues both connected to and aggravating our energy future problems. We see the real estate markets, of course, are one of the leading indicators of sort of socioeconomic crisis. Of course, the financial markets haven't come around and are arguably still not through the worst of their meltdown. And I think we've seen energy markets already in the last 6 to 7 months since oil peaked at $147 a barrel. There's been roughly a 5% decrease in demand for oil during that second half of 2008, and that was accompanied by a price reduction of almost 75%. On the other hand, the National Commission on Energy of the U.S. Had a simulation exercise in 2005, which you can find on the web in that report, Oil Shockwave. There they suggested that going in the other direction, a 4% shortfall in the supply, whether through depletion or supply constraints through wars in the Middle East or some other scenario, would have yielded a price increase of 177%. When I first started giving these talks, people thought 4% change leading to 177% price increase was crazy. But now we see it in the other direction, that a relatively small amount in supply or demand for oil can lead to very large price swings. So the world is becoming a lot more volatile around energy, as well as other economic and I think also social situations. And I think transport will be one of the things that has to change the most because of this. We've done a very good job in North America of powering our transportation system off of oil. 95% of the world's mobility and 98.5% in the U.S. Is fueled by gasoline, diesel, kerosene, for reasons we can get into that involve a lock-in of technology, but also some very powerful organizational interests to keep that relationship there. Something that may not be as well documented, but is very important to keep in mind, is that ever since 1990, we've been using oil, the majority of the world's oil, for transportation. And it's now 56% of the world's oil supplies that go into mobility globally. The U.S., again, is using even more of its oil for transportation. So if we're going to try and have a sustainable future environmentally as well as economically, we're going to need to reduce that. I've given talks like this to high school students, and I say to them, imagine this pie chart, take away all the labels, and if someone said, well, we have to find a more efficient way of dealing with this allocation, where would you start? They say, well, you start with the biggest piece. There's got to be more room for efficiency and savings in that, and they're right. So the good news is that because we use so much oil for transportation, there is actually plenty of room to save it. We're going to have to do it in ways that involve the title of our book, Transport Revolutions. This is not one. This is the world's first solar-powered aircraft, and it's put here as a technology caution tale. The good news is zero oil and zero greenhouse gas emissions. The bad news is that it carries no freight or people, and then it crashed on its third test flight. Maybe in 50 years there will be a solar-powered aircraft that can get a few people or a modest amount of payload up in the air. But this is not the sort of thing that will be available in time for us. And we have to be very careful whether it's solar-powered aircraft or hydrogen highways or other sort of techno solutions to make sure that they actually are available in that period, if you believe 2012 plus or minus 5 years, in that period that they're ready for actual use in the transportation system. And what we're looking at, I think, is a substantial change in less than 25 years. Our definition is a 50% increase in some types of transportation, a 50% decrease on the order in others. And what does that mean for us? I won't go into the details of the book. It means greater use of electricity, which is another proven form of transportation propulsion, greater use of rail and water, and less use of road and air, and a greater use of collectively managed, which doesn't necessarily mean public. Collectively managed is, Air Canada filling the seats on its aircraft very effectively as well, as opposed to each of us individually getting into a vehicle whenever we feel like it. So those are the trends that transport revolutions in the future will feature. Here's real-world examples. High-speed rail is a zero-carbon. It can be, and in many places where it's used, it is a zero-carbon mode of intercity passenger transport. It's running late in North America, but we'll get there. In California, in November elections, they finally approved the first serious high-speed rail project in North America. We can talk about that if people are interested in. Here's zero-carbon intercity freight. Those tracks that are out there, all you have to do is put wires up on them, and there is proven technology out there to take away all diesel fuel particulate emissions, as well as the use of that to move freight. And this could be particularly useful in British Columbia, where there's lots of hills. Here's low-carbon intercity freight transport in Canada. Just by using the diesel engines, you're still using 1/4 less fuel than by putting those containers on the road. And here we have low-carb intercontinental shipping. Some people see, peak oil as necessarily putting an end to globalization. It may have that effect through other indirect ways, or conflict and geopolitical fights over the world's oil, but it isn't physically necessary to stop shipping stuff long distances. Here you see the first commercial run of the new version of wind harnessing shipping, sky sails. This technology cuts marine transportation oil use, which is already the most efficient way of moving freight when it's possible, cuts it 50 to 80%. So I don't necessarily believe that we're going to see the end of intercontinental trade, the end of shipping. In fact, I think we're going to see different kinds. We may see, for example, in 15 years, if people in Alberta want citrus during the winter and orange juice and that sort of thing, it may come up the west coast on ship to Vancouver. Then the question is, how is it going to get to them? If there's the nice electric rail, then it can go all the way with very little oil use. If it isn't, there'll still be ways to move it on rail. But anyway, I do think that ports and that part of the Gateway program should not be written off as hopelessly impossible in an energy-short world. And of course, here we have local transportation, our trolley bus in the top, the Portland streetcar is another example. I threw in the cargo tram from Dresden just to show that in some European cities, they're moving cargo on public transit freight tracks, trolley tracks, I should say. This is palletized freight that connects several auto assembly plants in Europe, which is run on the local transit system. So where are we in all of this? Well, Vancouver led North America in taking a time out from highway expansion in the 1970s, and a lot of what we're known for stems from that. And now, as I suggested, we're heading, just as everyone else is finally giving up on road expansion as the preferred transportation option, we're looking, the goal of the program is creating a network that supports improved movement. All of that sounds great, but then when you look at the logo, the thing at the top, it says improving roads and bridges. And the problem is that that technology, as it's used by oil-powered vehicles, is not something that has much of a future for it. I borrowed this slide, of course, from our friends at the Gateway Sucks organization, but it raises the question that British Columbia's government has gone out on a limb, dealing with climate change. 33% reduction commitment by 2020, first jurisdiction in North America to have a carbon tax, and that is on a collision course with expanding road infrastructure for transportation that is exclusively powered by oil. Then, maybe because of the protests and pointing out this issue, the province has a $14 billion transit plan, which came after Gateway. Rather than having a combined synthesis of these things, these are sort of two parallel activities. Now, there's some professional geographers in the room here, so I don't I'm an amateur at this, but even for someone who has very little sense of geographic theory or practice, it seems to me that almost all of the transit investment is going north of the Fraser River. The big hole in this is where there needs to be transit most, which is where there's the least of it already, south of the Fraser. But that happens to be the place where the road and highway-oriented plans are in place. So it seems to me like we have two parallel plans. One is to develop a sustainable set of communities north of the Fraser that will be linked by rapid transit, which can be oil-free and carbon-free, with a little bit of a stub going down somewhere into Surrey. And the rest of it is going to be like auto-oriented sprawl that, as I said, most jurisdictions in North America are now turning away from. This is the equivalent of stepping on the gas and the brake at the same time, in my view. And I don't think that we can afford a transportation policy that does that. It doesn't do well for the engine of the vehicle. It won't do well for our economic engine. We're going to need that money to go in one direction, and my view is it needs to go to transit first. In the book, we have the simple prescription that when you realize you're in a hole, whether it's energy or climate or economics, the first thing you have to do to get out is to stop digging. And by expanding the highway and bridge infrastructure for oil-powered motor vehicles, that's digging ourselves in deeper. I could keep going, but I think I'll stop now in the interest of time and turn it back to our MC.